they talk about lines of effort and they talk about unity of effort. And as I was reflecting on this agreement last night, I believe that's what this does. It sets out very clear lines of effort, which has been important, but more importantly, it sets out the process of having a unity of effort. And when we do those two things together, that's where we make progress. Whether it's attacking a pandemic or attacking the very serious issues of Indigenous disadvantage for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in this country. And the other thing we did is we listened and we identified these things. And we looked at how we had not been making the progress all of us wanted on closing the gap. We reflected on the fact that closing the gap and the initiative taken by Kevin Rudd was an entirely worthy initiative and an initiative deserving of credit. But innocently, there were elements of how that was done which was misguided. That's not a criticism, that is a learning of these many years that have passed since then, as we've sought to live up to those worthy aspirations at that time. And one of the mistakes that have been made is, as we've looked at this as a federal government, we've decided what the gap is. We didn't look at the gap through the eyes of Indigenous Australians. We told Indigenous Australians what the gap was that we were going to close, and somehow thought they should be thankful for that. That was wrong-headed. That wasn't the way to do it. We needed to understand what the gap was, looking through the lens and the eyes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They needed to tell us what the gap was that needed to be closed. And that's what this task has been about. It has also been about understanding that this is not the task or role or responsibility of any one organisation, level of government or nation of peoples across the country. This is the task of us all. And for that to be successful, we need a partnership between all of these groups, understanding what these lines of effort are to achieve this unity of effort. And so we set about achieving a partnership and setting out these 16, as I understand, particular areas of activity, underpinned by 4 key things we're seeking to do to make them possible. And the first of those is partnership, a partnership of states and territories who have significant roles to play in achieving the outcomes that are set out here in this agreement. This is not something the Commonwealth can even pretend to think it can do alone. It must be done together with the service delivery and policy arms of state and territory governments, but also with the delivery agencies of Indigenous organisations which are on the ground making a difference. Secondly, it's about building the capabilities of those on-the-ground, community-based organisations in Indigenous communities to deliver those services as best as they possibly can. It is about transforming mainstream government agencies and institutions and how they conceive these challenges and how they go about engaging and delivering their services and broader policies that impact on Indigenous Australians, whether they're directed to them specifically or not. And it's about getting the right data, the right evidence, and the right reporting that creates the transparency to drive the actions we're seeking to get progress from. The data then, as it's set out in each of these 16 areas, is incredibly well presented in terms of what we need. Sets out the goal, and those goals haven't changed drastically. But what it has done is identified the things that make that goal achievable and the signs you need to look for along the way to know you're going to meet that goal, and how we're progressing against those key data points. And it gets granular. It says we're not just going to look up here, we're going to go down to community level. We're going to go and break this up by different groupings to understand where the real challenges are and where our progress is doing well. As Ken has often said, this process has to acknowledge the gains to drive the confidence that other areas can see achievement. But it's also about separating out where the accountabilities lie to get the action. And then there is the further data that is needed to drive the whole process. And there are some serious weaknesses when it comes to the intelligence and information that we need to inform plans to eliminate Indigenous disadvantage in this country as much as we possibly can. And so I find it a very practical document, Pat and Ken. I commend you on the work that it's done. It's realistic, it's shared, it's evidence-based and led, it's transparent, it's practical, it's ambitious. And from this point, the real work starts. And the plans that are needed from the federal government, from the state governments, the plans that need to find their way into budgets. But I tell you where we start. We start with what we have to do, and then we apply the resources to achieve that. This isn't about buckets of money. This is about changing the way we do things and ensuring that we apply the resources most effectively to achieve that. And with that, I'll pass you on to Ken and then to Pat.
Prime Minister, thank you very much. I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land we are today, their elders, past and present. The concept of closing the gap was an idea that arose from the Human Rights Commissioner of the day, Tom Calma. Tom put forward a series of propositions, and the first signing of a closing the gap agreement was done by a former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. The intentions were honourable. The outcomes were never achieved in the way that we had aspired to reach in the way of improving the lives of Indigenous Australians. And this particular agreement is historic because it goes to the very thing that I said right at the beginning when I first came into this role, that we need to develop approaches to address the issues of inequality and inequity by having Indigenous Australians sitting and jointly designing, planning and developing a direction that is based on how we wrap around people, their life expectancy, their life expectations and their aspirations from the community level through to the peak organisations. It's been an incredible privilege working with Pat and the 51 peak organisations. When we first started, there was 21, and then it grew. But the more people that were involved, the greater the depth of discussion around what do these targets mean? How will they change the lives of people? And how will we bring governments with us? And that was a critical part of the conversation as to how do we then take it to the next stage, because primarily it was the Prime Minister who tabled the Closing the Gap report. There was no requirement for states and territories to do that. This agreement with through the state and territory cabinet processes has endorsed a new approach, an approach that will involve Aboriginal people as partners in the design of the work of government agencies. It will involve transforming the way in which government agencies at every level, including local government, work with Indigenous Australians. It also commits, through the cabinet process, ministers in all portfolios to work towards achieving closure in the targets and the gap that is associated with the targets. But I think more importantly is the way in which the spirit of intent for the outcome we've achieved today in this agreement was reached through the passion and commitment of so many people. I want to acknowledge Pat's leadership. If you work with Indigenous organisations, as she has done, she has certainly brought 51 significant leaders to the table to agree on the targets that we have within the agreement, including incarceration rates, including family safety and the safety of women, and expanding those targets to focus in key and critical areas. But I also want to acknowledge every state and territory Aboriginal Affairs Minister, because their officials and the officers from the National Indigenous Agency and the officers who work with Pat in the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation worked paragraph by paragraph through the agreement until all parties were satisfied. But the thing that is different this time is the enthusiasm of all to address these targets. And Prime Minister, I want to acknowledge you because you've done something that no other Prime Minister has done, and that is to put faith in the Indigenous community to develop targets for us all to achieve, but for all of us to take responsibility for and for all of us to be accountable for. And by all of us focusing on those three tranches, I am extremely optimistic that we will see closures in areas to a greater extent than what we've seen historically in the past. And the amount of goodwill means that the reforms that we seek to achieve will now be done in a way that is very different. It means a person living in Bladderwich or living in Balgo, WA, or in Arunta country will have avenues in which to influence government policy and direction, and to have a say on those things that impact on them through our peaks and through the other structures that exist within states and territories. So I compliment all who are involved, and whilst I've been Minister, I've enjoyed the immense journey of the very meaty debates, but the way in which we have come together to produce a blueprint for improving the lives of our people across this nation with flow-on effects for all Australians. It is part of the Morrison government's commitment to having a change of direction that is going to make a difference on the ground with state and territory premiers and chief ministers who, through National Cabinet, have signed up to this agreement, along with the President of the Australian Local Government Association, so it means that local government equally will be involved in achieving the outcomes. I'd now like to ask Pat to come forward and make her comments.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you, Prime Minister. Today truly is an historic occasion. This is the first time a national agreement designed to improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been developed and negotiated between Australian governments, local government and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives. We have come a long way as partners since the Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap came into effect in March last year, and I want to thank each government for the spirit in which they have approached the partnership. I particularly want to thank you, Prime Minister, for your leadership in taking the first step in agreeing to establish a formal partnership between the Coalition of Peaks and governments on closing the gap. The Prime Minister probably didn't fully realise what he was committing to, and possibly no government did, but maybe that was a good thing at the time. Today, we now have a comprehensive set of commitments from governments that places Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations at the centre of closing the gap. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know what is best for our communities, not governments, and this national agreement means that decisions of government on closing the gap need to be negotiated and agreed with us. But I have to say, the Prime Minister and Ken will know, it hasn't always been easy, and some of our negotiations have been very hard fought. For the Coalition of Peaks, the national agreement is not just words. They represent actions that can make a real difference to the lives of our people, our families and our communities. We have also had the voices of more than 4,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who participated in our engagements on what should be included in the new national agreement, guiding us in our negotiations. The Coalition of Peaks is confident that the national agreement, if fully implemented, has the potential to establish a strong policy foundation to give effect to what our people have been saying for a long time is needed to make a difference. The national agreement may not include everything our people want or need to make lasting change to our lives, but this is a huge step forward. I also want to thank all the members of the Coalition of Peaks. This is the first time our community-controlled leadership have come together in this way to bring our collective experiences and expertise to the task of closing the gap, and it has been a real privilege to work with my colleagues in the Peaks. It is important that we celebrate today's achievements We are marking a turning point in Indigenous affairs and the relationship between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives. And we have all played our parts. But the real hard work starts tomorrow, as we begin the implementation of the National Agreement in full partnership between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, organisations and representatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Let's take questions on this matter and then we can return to the pandemic issues afterwards. Yeah.
We've heard many moving and passionate speeches by Prime Ministers and Ministers over the last 12 years about this subject, and every year moving speeches by Prime Ministers and Ministers lamenting the fact that governments have fallen woefully short of meeting the targets. What commitment can you give that these new targets will actually be met?
Well, it has the full backing of our entire government. I said when Ken was appointed as the first Minister for Indigenous Australians as an Indigenous Australian, that every minister in my cabinet is a Minister for Indigenous Australians, because that's the change, that's the shift that needs to have effect to actually make more progress. I think you're right, Mark. There's never been any lack of passion or commitment or dedication from this podium, no matter who stood behind it. Every Prime Minister that I know has shared this passion and this dedication, but also the frustration that goes along with the lack of progress in this area. What I think is different about this process is there has been some humble learnings that has led to its development and its execution. There has been a recognition that in sometimes we've been too ambitious without understanding the detail of what you actually have to do to get there. And what I particularly like about this agreement is how, as I explained before, it gets very granular about how you get there and how you know when you're not getting there. And that's very important. This evidence-led process, which has an accountability to it, which I think is very important. Now, I'd love to give you a guarantee, like every one of my predecessors would have, and endeavoured tried to, as I am today. But I am tempered by that bitter experience of my predecessors and my own. And so I take comfort in the fact that we've got a partnership now that we haven't had before. It's not because others didn't want it. I think the partnership is the product of the learnings, the humble learnings that have been necessary. So I do hope, Mark, that we can live up to this. We owe it to every Indigenous boy and girl in the country today and every Indigenous person in the country today. Yep.
Prime Minister and Minister Wyatt, there's been some criticism of the fact that the domestic violence target is not being announced today and it's going to continue to be worked on. Can you explain why given what we know about the overrepresentation of First Nations women as victims of domestic violence, why that is still being worked on and is not being announced today?
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'll let Ken and Pat speak to that because they've been directly involved in those decisions.
Excuse me, in dealing with this issue, we want zero tolerance of any domestic violence or violence against women. I know that when the working group was going through this, the focus on just physical violence against women was seen as not sufficient. That hasn't lowered our bar for absolute extinction of domestic violence against any woman. And this fits within the 4th National Plan that our government has in place as well. But our senior women have asked that we do more work on that, and I respect the request that they have made, and we will come back with further work, but the target is still zero tolerance of domestic violence against our women. Pat?
Yeah, thank you. So we do have some more work to do in our negotiations with all of the governments. It is a national priority and one that we take very seriously, and we hope to have that nutted out as we go through in the next few months, and we start our work on the implementation plans to get some real nutty figures in there. Let me say on the national agreement, it's very important that you read it in detail and you understand it, because there are funding provisions that are already committed to in the national agreement, and they will come on board as we progress the important work now on the implementation plans. and the important work that we have to do to make sure that we have the right people at the right table, at the right time, in the right place.
I think fundamentally, I mean, what I drew from all of that was that because the further work is required is a statement of how serious that goal is taken and the other contributing causes to how we achieve that goal, not just the physical violence, which is deplorable, whether it is in Indigenous communities or non-Indigenous communities, as we know, and there are separate plans to deal with that issue more broadly in the country, but the many other non-physical ways that abuse occurs and the link between that and physical abuse, and to ensure that we're getting that right. So I think it's a statement of just how seriously the agreement does take it and the partners do take it. Yeah, Chris.
Prime Minister, through you to Pat, can you tell us, because of all the plans that we've had in the past, why you think, in simple terms, there's reason to hope this time that young Indigenous children can have what the future the Prime Minister hopes?
Yeah, I think it's because we've been at the table and we'll continue to stay at the negotiating table to make sure that governments do change the way they do business with us, that their program and policy responses are informed by our experience and expertise, and as much as possible that our own organisations, community-controlled organisations, are resourced to do the service delivery. We get much better outcomes when we deliver the services to our people ourselves. We're just as happy. We've always been accountable for what we've done, and we are certainly accountable to our communities, the way we work, and we're more accountable in terms of the scrutiny placed on our organisations. I'd like that to be, all of that red tape to be reduced, of course, enable us to get on with the job. But I believe because we're involved in all of those decisions from now on, that we will actually get better results. Now, everyone's got to work in the true spirit of the partnership, and, you know, the resources have to be available when they're needed to ensure that the right areas are being thing. But you have to understand that in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, there's been a long history of underinvestment by governments, and we're dealing with that legacy, and we will deal with that legacy, but the issues are so interrelated. Just take the social determinants of health, which are impacted by where you're born, how you grow and how you live your life. Sir Michael Marmot is the world expert on this. He has spoken many times about this needing to be addressed in Australia. The World Health Organisation wants it addressed, we want it addressed. So, you know, that will take a coordinated across-government effort and intergovernmental efforts, and we will be making sure that they do their very best, because you have to improve where people live, how they live, their opportunities for engagement in the workforce in a real way to have jobs. We create more jobs if our organisations do the service delivery and are funded properly. We employ more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our organisations, and we want that to happen because we want our people off of welfare dependency.
Is it fair to ask Indigenous organisations to close a gap that governments over the past 10 years have been unable to narrow in key areas despite all the resources at their disposal? And how will these community-led organisations be funded to reach these important targets?
Well, I think what Pat just outlined was a very good summary of the conclusions that have been drawn by this process. I mean, there have been significant resources directed to these tasks over many years, but the way those resources have been applied have not always got the results. I've seen some of the most extraordinary responses and outcomes from some of the most modest elements of funding to community-based organisations. And I mean, Clontarf is one that I've often talked to you. I have a personal association with it, so I have a massive declared bias. But how I've seen that change the lives of young Indigenous boys and men has just been extraordinary. And that hasn't been the result of massive investments by government. It's been the result of an extraordinary program and local community leadership and participation. So Pat's point is, and I agree with it, is that this process actually seeks to empower and better resource and support local-led delivery of services. And this is where the Coalition of the Peaks comes into it. This is why we're talking to the Coalition of Peaks, because they're the Indigenous organisations that deliver services in communities. You don't get any more closer to the ground than that. Now, that just, in the first instance, involves ensuring that the balance of how funding is delivered and the channels through which funding is delivered is done properly. And that's why Pat rightly says that the hard work starts tomorrow, because that is one of the key areas that we're looking to adjust, and Ken and Pat will have a bit more to say about that in the near future. But you're right to note it as a key issue we've had to learn. And that's why I hope this process then drives. And not just by Commonwealth Government, by the way. I mean, what this process has recognised is it's fine for a Prime Minister to stand at the dispatch box once every year and talk about what the gaps are and how they're failing. But the Commonwealth is one part in a much bigger team of governments that actually deliver services to Indigenous people and fund those services.
Ms Turner,
Yes.
just in achieving these goals, how important is it to make progress on tangential issues like remaining vigilant against things like institutionalised racism and, you know, pursuing matters like constitutional recognition, voices to Parliament and so forth?
All of those processes in relation to the voice to Parliament, constitutional recognition, are complementary and should continue, and will continue. And the Minister, of course, is overseeing that. In relation to why will we get a tangible difference now, is because our voices have been heard and will continue to be heard, but our influence, our expertise, our experience and our know-how and the relationships that we have at the community level. So my day job is CEO of NACHO, which is 143 Aboriginal community-controlled health services around Australia. And we stepped in very early this year in our preparations for COVID-19. January we started, and we worked in full partnership with every level of government, from the shires through to the state governments and the federal government, of course, and we were able to keep our communities pretty safe. Less than 1% of our population Australia-wide, or out of the COVID numbers today, have tested positive. Overall, we had 59 cases confirmed. There's been a further 45 in Victoria since as of the 28th of July, and 3 that I know of in Western Sydney. Fortunately, we've had no deaths. Now, the Aboriginal Community Control's health sector has played a critical role in working in full partnership with governments to ensure that our people are protected and are safe. And thank God we've had no deaths. And I want to say to all Victorians today, our hearts go out to you, and we are with you every step of the way. To those who have lost family members in recent weeks to COVID, you know, please accept our deepest condolences. We don't want any more people in Australia to suffer the consequences of this dreadful virus, and every Australian must pull their weight to keep our people safe.
Well said, Pat. One of the most significant achievements Australia has had during the COVID pandemic has been the extraordinary result in Indigenous communities amongst Indigenous peoples. It was, I've got to say, around the National Cabinet table, together with our elderly, our highest concern as to how the pandemic might affect Australia, and particularly in remote communities. And whether it's the Northern Territory, Northern Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, it doesn't matter where it was. And the way the services have worked together to get that outcome, Pat, I think is extraordinary. It's good working with people who know how to get things done. Yeah, time for a couple of more. Yep.
Prime Minister, you speak about the implementation plans you're going to get from the states and territories and the historic work you're going to be doing with community-controlled organisations. If we fast forward a year or two and you are seeing failures, what reassurance can you give that the onus of responsibility for that is still going to be with the Commonwealth?
Well, it's going to be with everyone who's signed up to this agreement. And that's the Commonwealth, that's the states and territories, that's the Coalition of Peace. That's the whole point of this, that this is about accountability for what we each do and recognising the role we have to play. See, when we entered into this, I learnt and understood that if you want to make progress here, then you've got to get everybody to go together. And this is the advice that Pat gave us. This is the learnings that Ken brought to the table. And so that's what we're doing. We're bringing people together and applying ourselves in a unity of effort to these lines of effort. Lines of effort defined by the voices of Indigenous people, coming back through the Coalition of Peaks. So, look, I hope in 2 years the story is better. But I can tell you what, if it's not, there will be an accountability train. There will be a set of data that will tell us why. And there should be an humility which enables us to acknowledge that and make changes. Yeah, Claire?
Entrenched some of these intergenerational issues, specifically around incarceration rates. Are you confident, given the overrepresentation of young people, in particular in detention, young Indigenous people, that these targets, the benefits, will reach to that generation now, or will this take almost a whole generation for them, for their children, say, to not be facing those same rates?
There are gains that can be made now, but I mean, Ken, you might want to comment on this as well. There are gains that can be made now, but there's an honesty in this agreement which understands that other gains are generational. And I've been hearing that for generations too. And that's a key issue of disappointment. The generations have come and gone and the generational changes haven't been made. That's not to fail to acknowledge, though, the generational achievements that have been put in place. Of course there have been some and many, but our hope is higher.
Just adding to that, in the discussions I've had with states and territories, the understanding of the intergenerational impact is now very conscious in the minds of state and territory systems. WA, for example, has repealed its legislation in respect to being incarcerated for fine defaults. That's a major shift because you're releasing, and it's predominantly women, you're releasing mothers back to their families. That example is important. I know a couple of other jurisdictions are looking at issues as well, but what we have to focus on is setting the foundation in the first 15 years of life so that children are successful and will not end up in the pathways that take them into conflict with systems that see them incarcerated. We also are looking at what are the programs we need to put in place for people coming out of imprisonment that will allow them to take opportunities. And I want to acknowledge one of your organisations, Pat, in Kalgoorlie. The Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Service now recruits people who've come out of jail. They look at the issue of recency of a crime, but they also look at the way in which they can skill young people or people that come out. And what they've said to me is that their workforce is completely loyal. They've been given a great opportunity and they're continuing to professional develop into other leadership roles in the organisation. So we'll be looking at those elements as well as part of the implementation plans, but listening to Aboriginal families and communities on the ground as well. This is all part of the historic reform. It is now doing things with our people, not to them.
Okay, I think we're going to have just two more because then we're going to have to move on to here and then we're on. I mean, you can ask the other one later, Kath.
Prime Minister, 3 weeks ago in Victoria when they went into lockdown, there was something like 600 active cases. Today, there's more than...
Hang on, we're still talking about Indigenous issues. Yep.
Prime Minister, Pat mentioned that some of these negotiations had been pretty hard fought. What were some of the sticking points? And Pat, can I ask of you, what are the areas you'd like to see further action beyond what's been announced today?
Well, there are the key priority areas that are identified in the agreement, and let me say that this agreement has probably the most transparency, the most monitoring and the most accountable mechanisms that have ever been included in an agreement. And this is the first time that there's been an agreement with the former COAG, now National Cabinet and Local Government Association, with an outside party. First time ever. And I'm glad it's First Nations people that have got that. But you will see here that every year, every level has to account for what it's done, and we will be reviewing continuously. And we have national targets. Even the priority reforms have targets that have to be reported upon. Targets are just a measure of how well they are doing, governments are doing, and the level of ambition that they've been prepared to commit to. The priority reforms, as I said, are the game changers here. They will change the way government works with our people, and governments, you know, we've made it very clear we want parity across the board, and that's what we'll be aiming for.
We'll go here, we'll go here, and then we'll go to Kath, and then we'll have to draw that part of the press conference to a close, and then I'll move to the pandemic.
I've got a question on Victoria as well.
Okay, well, okay, wait, Catherine.
One on this, certainly, and then a pandemic question, if I can, Prime Minister.
We'll come back to the pandemic one. Let's
No
just deal with
worries.
this one
Yeah,
first.
yeah, and you might address it. But
We'll have to deal with those later. Yeah. Please.
yes, so you've all, during this press conference, narrated a highly successful process of co-design in terms of policy. Obviously, it's been bumps and difficulties and all that sort of stuff, but you've got there. That's the principle at the heart of the voice, that Indigenous people be involved in government decision-making. So doesn't the success of this project that you've all embarked upon make the case to accelerate the voice?
Well, there's never been a view from the government that has in any way sought to not engage and not listen and not have Indigenous voices as part of the way we're making decisions, and I think that's what we've demonstrated. And you know me, Catherine, I'm a very practical person about these issues, and I think what we're practically demonstrating is that model is already working. It is already occurring, and I will continue to operate in that way. And that's the process that Ken is also tracking down on the other matters that you've referred to.
Catherine, just very quickly, the work is continuing. Excuse me, the three groups are reaching a point at which they are considering models for government to consider. The Coalition of Peaks is a very distinct group that will lead in many fronts in the closing the gap. But this is about giving all Indigenous people across this nation a chance to exercise their views on issues that impact directly on them at the community level as well.
Okay, well, so Pat, if I could say thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Ken? Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
And as they go, I particularly want to acknowledge Tony Abbott. He has had an enormous impact on my understanding and appreciation of these issues when I worked with Tony many years ago when we were in opposition, actually, and then in government as Prime Minister. And I just want to acknowledge the impact that he's had in how we've been approaching these issues here today.